Hello, and so glad everybody's here. We're mighty glad that you are, and there's an awful lot going on at MTSU today and actually all across Middle Tennessee. It's Women's Day on the Hill, so a lot of folks from Poli-Sci and League of Women Voters are busy with that. A lot of our folks from College of Media and Entertainment are actually downtown because today happens to be the 100th birthday party of the Grand Ole Opry, so MTSU is involved in a lot of filming of that. And of course it's Scholars Week, and today is College of Liberal Arts Day of Scholars Day. So we've got many wonderful programs happening all over campus, and we're mighty glad that you came to join us, so we thank you for that. So I want to say on behalf of the Middle Tennessee State University and our sponsors, who are the Women and Gender Studies program here at the university, the Department of History, the Department of Political Science. Oh, wait, it's not called that anymore. Help me out. It's the Department of Political and Global Affairs. Did I get that right? The College of Liberal Arts, the College of Media and Entertainment, and the University Honors College, where we're meeting today. And of course, thank you especially to the Distinguished Lecture Fund. So welcome everybody to MTSU. Glad that our classes are here and our visitors from the community, and happy National Women's History Month. So students, if you're here, most of you have signed in for class credit. There's that yellow legal pad over there. And if your professor's not here, we'll be sure that they get notified that you were getting that extra credit for attending. We invite all of you to stick around afterwards. We're going to have a reception from the fine caterers of Aramark in our lobby after this is over, so please join us for that. And also just want to say sort of preemptively that although we will sort of have questions at the end, if you have questions while we're going through this, raise your hand, jump up. This is a small room, it's wonderfully interactive, and I'm hoping that most of you have actually seen the film and you'll have some very concrete questions to pose to our two folks here today. So we're very pleased to be part of MTSU's very robust National Women's History Month lineup of important programs, and we use it to teach about diverse women who have worked their way into mainstream society, to be included in at the tables of power, to try to reach equity in our U.S. society, and to be clear, however, sometimes we need to point out that that has not happened. We have not yet elected a woman president of the United States. Women have not yet made up all 9 members of the U.S. Supreme Court, and despite there being 50% of the U.S. population women, they constitute only 1/3 of the U.S. House of Representatives and only 1/4 of our U.S. Senate. So that's why we continue to teach about women whose agency and active participation in all arenas of power have always been there. Women have always been working and pushing and achieving and breaking glass ceilings and cutting pathways for those of us who are to follow. And we tend to know an awful lot less about many who these powerhouse women were. They were movers and shakers. They are the unsung heroines and heroes of feminism. They lived lives to uplift all of us and make the world better. And so that is absolutely why we're here today, to talk about one of those women. And she's in the photo behind me, and her name was Liz Carpenter, and she was a Texan. So the discussion today will be about details and specifics, but let me give you just her very brief bio. And here's again where I hope you've already actually seen the film. And if not, just a reminder that it is currently available on pbs.org. All you have to do is Google pbs.org shaking it up, pbs.org shaking it up, and it'll pop up for you to watch. It's going to shortly move to Passport, so you have to have subscription, but it will be showing here on National PBS in May. Liz Carpenter was born Mary Elizabeth Sutherland. She was born in 1920, the very year that women earned the right to vote. She was born in her ancestral home in rural Bell County, Texas, Salado, Texas, south of Austin. And for Liz, to us here in Tennessee, the home she was born in was the Robertson Plantation. So that name Robertson is important to us in Tennessee because obviously we know it from the founder of Nashville. General James Robertson was the several greats on back uncle of Liz Carpenter. And his younger brother was Colonel Elijah Robertson, who was Liz's several greats grandfather on back. They came and were part of that Fort Nashboro settlement. They helped settle right on the Cumberland. And then after about 50 years, a group of the Robertsons, as the family grew and expanded, moved on further west and settled Texas as well. So they are founding families of both of our states. Mary Elizabeth, or Liz, was their descendant. And she was following in the footsteps, actually, of generations of powerful women role models in her life. Folks who were indomitable and potent and who led the way in so many arenas. So she was really taking on the mantle of those who'd gone before. She went to the University of Texas at Austin. She got a journalism degree. And during World War II, she took off for Washington, D.C. to build a career for herself. And along the way, she married a young man from Texas with whom she'd actually gone to high school and to college, and he followed her to D.C. He was also a journalist. His name was Mr. Leslie Carpenter. And they had 2 children, one of whom is with us today. And Liz Carpenter lived in Washington, D.C. from the 1940s into the 1970s. And as a widow at that point in time, she returned to Texas, her home state, for the last decades of her life. So the story of Liz Carpenter's life is really told in 3 parts. It's a woman in journalism story, it's a woman at the center of national and global politics story, and it's a feminist story of a woman pushing hard for constitutional equity for all of American women. So to recap, as a journalist, she was not really interested in writing fashion or society columns. She wanted access to the halls of power, and she became an insider in D.C., reporting back to Texas newspapers about what was going on in Washington. She reported through the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration, Truman and Eisenhower, and having become well known and respected by Texas U.S. Senator Lyndon Baines Johnson during the 50s, he was bidding for the Democratic nomination for the presidency in 1960. It was sort of a bitter Democratic Party slosh and fight, but ultimately that nomination went to John F. Kennedy, and Johnson was selected as VP, and he asked Mrs. Liz Carpenter to join his team and be a press spokesperson for him as a VP candidate, and then to join his vice presidential team as well. And in that capacity, and when Vice President Johnson became dramatically President Johnson after the assassination of JFK in Dallas, it was on that plane flying back from Texas to Washington that Liz Carpenter was the one who penned the very famous first words that LBJ as a president of the United States ever spoke publicly. In the White House, she was staff director and press secretary to First Lady, Lady Bird Johnson. And after the Johnson White House, when he stepped down at the end of 1968, Liz went on to be co-founder of the National Women's Political Caucus and to chair ERA America. She traveled the country working for the Equal Rights Amendment, and in 1977 she was one of the major organizers of the National Women's Conference for ratification of the ERA. And we will be celebrating that important gathering of women back in 1977 in 2 years, because in 2027 will be the 50th anniversary of that. So it's sort of those 3 parts of the story that our discussants are going to talk about today. So our guest today from Austin, Texas is Ms. Christy Carpenter. She is Liz Carpenter's only daughter, and she knows all these stories very well, so she is a source of information. Christy is both co-producer and co-director of this film, Shaking It Up. And when Christy was in graduate school, if I understand this, at the London School of Economics for a period of time, it happened that she was a roommate with a young woman who would go on to become the important film producer Abby Ginsburg. And years later, Christy and Abby have collaborated on this documentary. As for Christy herself, she is a graduate both of Brown University and American University's Washington College of Law. She's worked for decades as an executive in both for-profit and non-profit sectors. A common thread throughout her professional career has been communications and media. She was both executive vice president and COO of the Paley Center for Media in New York, the premier organization for media, and she was CEO for a number of years for the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation Institute in Arkansas, bringing together thought leaders of national and international importance on issues that are relevant in everyday lives. So she has been involved for a long time with public television. She was appointed by former President Clinton to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting She served as its president at some point in time, and she's been involved with public television stations both in Los Angeles and in Austin, so PBS is part of her background as well, and she lives in Austin at the present day. So this documentary that she developed about her mother has premiered exactly a year ago in Austin, Texas at South by Southwest, and it opens this very week or has opened as earlier this week at public television stations for national public television all across the country. So to interview Christy today is Dr. Sarah Childress, who is with us from Nashville. She is the Director of Strategy and Operations at Nashville Public Broadcasting, where she advances strategic decision-making and she partners with independent producers to distribute their work to public television stations across the country. Sarah's multifaceted career has included work in advertising, in academia. As a university professor, she holds a PhD from Vanderbilt in cinema and arts through Vanderbilt University. She's overseen brand campaign development for major national companies. She's taught film courses. She's curated the Vanderbilt University Film Series. She's been at Bowdoin College, Belmont University, San Francisco State University, and she served as the Education and Engagement Manager for the Nashville Film Festival. And so she continues on the Belcourt Theater Board today. So Dr. Sarah Childress is our interviewer today, and we are thrilled that she has joined us. And so I'm going to pass it over to you, Sarah. We have no mics here, just so you know. This is using your old-fashioned teacher voice so that you can be both heard by the back row and by the folks who are filming us. So may I please have a round of MTSU welcome and applause, both for Sarah Childress and
thank you for getting us teed up so beautifully. Thank you for this wonderful invitation. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. As we've heard, you had many places you could have been, so we're really thrilled that you're here with us. Thank you so much, Christy, for being here with us. So I thought to get us going, and not just because I'm a film fanatic, but because we're all here to celebrate this amazing film. By the way, congratulations not only on a South by Southwest debut, which is, as y'all might imagine, a big deal, but also nationwide, all across the country distribution for this really fantastic documentary, which is going to enable so many more people to see the film. So maybe a good place to start would be like, how did you come up with the idea of the film? How did the film get started? How did it form?
The film got started, the idea for the film emerged in 2020. That was the 100th anniversary, it was the 100th anniversary of my mother's birth in September 1st of that year. And it was also the centennial of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. And I always considered it no coincidence whatsoever that my mother was born 5 days after that amendment was adopted. And so I wrote an article. I had done a lot of research going through my mom's papers, some I had, but the preponderance at the LBJ library, and starting in college, started when these boxes. I don't know if any of you save things, but she did. And so her papers are very extensive from college all the way to nearly that time she passed on. And so I was very steeped in many aspects of her life and planning to write a book, and I still hope I can get around to that. But I wrote an article about the these 200th anniversaries. And this old friend of mine, as Mary alluded to, Abby Ginsberg, who's a very accomplished filmmaker in the Bay Area, the San Francisco area. And she called me and said, I think I'd like to do she read it, the article, said, I think I'd like to do a documentary on your mom. And I hadn't thought about that. I've been involved in media for a lot of my career, but I'd never been a filmmaker. So this was a new mode for me to work in, and so we started collaborating. It was really a good match of skill sets. Her with all of her filmmaking experience, and me with my deep knowledge of my mother and people she knew, people I knew would be great interviews to put into the film. People like legendary journalists like Bill Moyers and Dan Rather and Gloria Steinem and the presidential historian Douglas Brinkley, and many others, and the two daughters of Lyndon Johnson and Lady Bird. And I knew all these people, so I was able to put all that together. That's how we got going. And I don't know if you want to take a little bit more on the process, but I could, because one of the first things we had to do was, I knew where there were there was a lot of archival material, photography, video, places where she'd been interviewed and so forth, but I didn't know everything, but I knew a lot. And so we hired an archival producer who went out and worked on finding the things I knew about, and she found much more. So we had a sort of a treasure trove of photography and video, and then we conducted the interviews with current people who are still living, but people who knew her well, who could shine a light on different aspects of her career. And it was a matter then of weaving it together. And so it's really, since it was my first time, I can say it's a daunting thing to make a documentary. It really took 3 years, and I think we feel very good about the way it came out. But it was quite an undertaking.
Well, I love that you're talking a little bit about the process, because one of the things that I was sort of thinking of, well, you're the subject matter expert, since you actually grew up with her. Right. But in terms of, I know when we were talking earlier, you were saying that you kind of knew where things were in the archive, or at least where to start finding, and I love that you also brought in someone to help you go through all that material. How did you choose? I mean, since, given that, as you were saying earlier, she saves so much, how were you able to kind of go through and choose out of everything, like the key points or the key stories to tell?
Well, from the beginning, I knew, and Abby concurred, that we should divide the film into 3 chapters. One, journalism. She came to Washington in 1942, just after graduating. She was 22 years old from the University of Texas, got on a train and went straight to Washington to try to get a job as a reporter. And maybe we can talk a little bit more about that period later. But anyway, the second chapter being her work briefly for Lyndon Johnson when he was vice president. I say briefly because he became president, after just a couple of years due to the assassination in Dallas. And she was with him on that trip. She was in the motorcade. She was on Air Force One. Mary said she wrote, started scribbling his remarks en route to Air Force One from Parkland Hospital, where Kennedy died. And then her leadership in the women's movement, primarily through the National Women's Political Caucus, and then also as the co-chair of ERA America. So there were 3 chapters, and I developed for the editors story points. Here in each of those chapters, here are the key things that I think we want to make sure we get across to tell the story. And so then the editors take over, and they work, and of course it's iterative. We're talking to the editors, but the editors really have the skill set to know how to take pieces of archive or a particular photo and weave it in as a way to tell the story. And we wanted to make sure that we told the story through Liz's voice to the greatest extent possible. So where we had interviews with her, or maybe she's talking in a, it's a news program, and they're just she's being featured in some fashion. But we wanted to use that to the greatest extent possible, because it really provides a richer profile of the person whose story you're depicting, if you can do a lot of it in that person's own voice.
Oh, I love that you say that, because that's so documentary is like one of my favorite things to study and think about. And one of the issues with documentary in particular is representation, representation, because essentially you're telling the story of another person, and often by doing that you take the voice of that person and that person's ability to represent themselves. So I love that you really try as much as you can to give Liz the opportunity to speak on her own behalf or
Yes.
for herself, to let her voice really come through.
Right.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Cool. So I'd love to, since you gave us this invitation, to talk a little bit more about that, the early phase of her life. I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about how this, I mean, I'm just amazed that your mother just gets on a train and goes to DC, has enough confidence and belief in herself that she's like, I'm not sticking in Texas, I'm going to DC. A little bit about that, but then also one of the things that came out in the film that I thought was so cool and so unusual, it seems like, and from what I know, you're more the expert than I am, but for the historical moment, your parents really seem to be partners in the fullest sense of that concept, which seemed to be quite revolutionary for that time. So here we have this revolutionary woman, this revolutionary marriage. I'd love to hear more.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, how many of you have seen the film so far? Okay.
sweet.
Oh, good.
Nice.
I feel that I'm glad. Because, you know, you can hear a biography, but to see its presentation in that form is, of course, more, by definition, more powerful. So, yes, she graduates from UT. She knew she wanted to be a journalist. She grew up with a lineage of people who really loved the written word, who read literature, who talked about it, who wrote, her mother wrote poems, but this had been passed down for generations, a real appreciation for reading and so forth. So she had this yearning, and so when she was in high school, she became the editor of the school newspaper. My dad was also at the same high school in Austin, Texas, and he was the business manager of the newspaper. And they both went off to the University of Texas and studied journalism. And it's amazing, but she really didn't ever seem to think, well, I'm going to start my career here in Austin. She'd already written some articles for the Austin paper. You know, maybe I should get some experience and maybe someday I'll get to Washington. No, she decides that she's going to go straight to Washington. It's wartime, 1942. She gets on a train. She goes. She really doesn't. I mean, her brother's living in Washington, but she really doesn't know people in Washington. So it was a pretty bold thing as a 22-year-old to do. And it was also bold because most newspapers had a policy of not hiring women journalists at all. If they did use them, it was really for society reporting or covering food or some such thing. Newspapers used to have the women's pages, or they'd be called the society pages. I know this is like ancient history to you all, but people actually got their news from newspapers, print that they would hold up. Anyway, so she went straight there. She had a scrapbook of clippings from the school newspaper, the Daily Texan. She had written for the university paper, and the Austin American Statesman. As she walked through the corridors of the National Press Building, where many press organizations had their offices, and knocked on doors. And she ended up getting a job, as she says in the film, part secretary, part reporter, for $25 a week. And it was actually, amazingly, a small news bureau, sort of Michigan-oriented, covering members of Congress from Michigan, and run by a woman. So, which was highly unusual. She got this job. It gave her a press pass. And so she started going to Eleanor Roosevelt's press conferences. She started going to Franklin Roosevelt's press conferences. And Eleanor, and if you watched all the film, you saw this, but Eleanor gave a boost to women in journalism by saying that only women reporters could come to her press conferences. And here she was. I mean, Eleanor Roosevelt was certainly the first lady to ever hold press conferences, and she was holding them pretty often. And so anyway, only women could go, and so my mother went, and would go, and it was just a thrill to be there at 22. She was sort of starry-eyed about the whole thing, and to stand in. The presidents would hold their press conferences in the Oval Office. And so the new people stood in back, and so she stood in the back of the room, and she said she could just see Franklin Roosevelt's cigarette holder, and the cigarette bouncing up and down. She stood on her tippy toes. But anyhow, that's how she got her start. And she quickly expanded the number of papers that she wrote for. My father finishes his military service in the war, and the two of them get married. And he starts working in the National Press Building also. And after 5 years or so, they form what became the Carpenter News Bureau, where they represented not just Texas papers, but a lot of newspapers in the Southwest. So, in terms of your question about my father, they really were 24/7 partners. My father was just, I can't explain why, but he just was a very enlightened man for that era, to not feel threatened, but to have this wife who did exactly the same work he did. They did it together. They did it in the same business, and as part of the same operation. And Washington was a very social town in those days. Mary grew up there too. She was there when I was there. We went to grade school together. So my parents were out at night, and the social scene in Washington, Republicans and Democrats were like together at parties all the time. Imagine that. And so it was important for reporters, if you got invited to go to things, to be there, because you could get information that might give you an idea for a story when you go to work the next day. Or you might develop a new source for the future. So that was important, but it really was an unusual marriage for the time. And as we interviewed a reporter who appears in the film, who was a reporter in the Carpenter News Bureau, and he says in the film they were Washington's first power couple before that was a term. So that was, they had a lot of, they got a lot of, I don't know, maybe added attention by virtue of the fact that they were this unusual pair.
Fascinating. Cool, so you've brought us to DC, and you've also painted for us the fact that there is kind of a social side, kind of a professional and a personal that seems to be working together. So I'm wondering, because I'm trying to remember exactly how your mother moved from being a reporter, covering all kinds of different political moments, to actually working as, I believe it's the first female executive assistant to LBJ. When he was vice president, is that correct? And then moves on, once he's president, to be Lady Bird's press secretary. How did she make that leap?
Okay, well, so, yeah, I mean, it started in the 1960 campaign. Kennedy's nominated for president, Johnson's nominated for vice president. And so the two of them called my mother. I don't mean I was in the room, although I might have been, but we're all at the Republican convention, because we did a cross-country trip, my brother and me and my parents. This is how I was brought up. First to the Democratic convention in Los Angeles in 1960, and seeing some national parks along the way as we go to Chicago for the Republican convention. And so, because they had to cover everything. So anyway, I get a phone call from Lady Bird and Lyndon saying, Liz, we'd like you to come join the great adventure of our lives. Meaning they wanted her to come and join the campaign and work with both of them, dealing with press and all kinds of miscellaneous things. So, and they knew each other well. I mean, Liz had started, and my father also, started covering LBJ when he was a member of the House of Representatives in 1942, and the whole way through his career up until that time, when he was a very powerful majority leader of the Senate. And so they really knew the Johnsons well, also because they had a lot of social interaction too. Anyway, so she goes to work during the campaign, and then goes back right afterwards back to being a reporter. And then about March of 1961, so Johnson's been vice president for about 2 months. Bill Moyers leaves his job to go help run the Peace Corps with Sergeant Shriver. You all may or may not know, was the President Kennedy's brother-in-law. Anyhow, so she's hired to work for him, and executive assistant's kind of that was the title, but that was kind of a misleading title, because today that connotes somebody who's like a very skilled secretary, but that was not what the job was. I mean, and the fact that a man had held it before her is further evidence that it was more than that. So she did all kinds of, press wrangling and traveled with him internationally. As vice president, he was sent on lots of international trips, as often happens with vice presidents. And a project manager of all stripes. He knew that she was somebody who, he knew her well, and so he knew she was just somebody who would roll up her sleeves and do whatever needed to be done. So that was a lot of miscellaneous activities. So that's how she started, and then of course she was with him, as we've already covered, in Dallas in November of 1963, and immediately was thrust into the White House as the chief of staff and press secretary to Lady Bird. But because she had a relationship with him as well, she was a little different than other press secretaries for first ladies up until that time. First of all, she's the first journalist that's ever held that role for a first lady. Second of all, because she had that relationship with him, she really would cross between the East and the West Wing, working on policy issues, and how to take the president's policies and translate them by leveraging Lady Bird's great skill and political savvy, going out and visiting poverty programs that were part of the Great Society, and education programs, and all the environmental programs, and taking reporters on these trips, and drawing attention to what, putting flesh and blood to the story of the Great Society. And so, and if she had an idea for something and needed to talk to him, she could just do it, which is not the way it is typically for First Lady staff, so.
Which is so incredible, and I want to thank you, because in addition to learning more about your mom, I also learned more about Lady Bird from the film, because I didn't realize how instrumental she had been in really bringing to public attention and bringing support to all of the projects that you just mentioned. So that was really wonderful. But to go back to how you're helping us to understand that Liz really had just extraordinary access, in part because she knew both LBJ and Lady Bird quite well, and there's some really wonderful moments of like back and forth, a little badinage with she and Lyndon. So I'd love to switch the focus and a little bit more to you, because I'm thinking like, wow, in the film, Liz comes across as like this force of nature, like the fact that she's kind of holding her own and she's got this amazing sense of humor. So what was it like growing up with her as a mom and being kind of around when these like interactions are taking place? It seems like an extraordinary.
Yeah, well, first of all, growing up as a child of two journalists, I mean, I grew up in a household where there was one conversation: politics. So, and then I had good friends who's like Mary, whose father was a member of the House of Representatives, and so I was at school and with friends that that I had, as well as at home. But my mother was a complete dynamo. I mean, a super high energy, funny, earthy, kind of charismatic, could be hilarious person. So this personality she had really allowed her to accomplish so much more than she would have had she not, if she had been a more meek and subdued type. Let's put it that way. So she'd come home and chaos in the house and the ringing telephones and lots of action, often just she and my father coming in the door and changing out their work clothes and into dressier clothes to go out to parties and so forth. But as her child, this is true of my brother, of course, as well. We had to develop certain skill sets at a very young age. I mean, one of them was learning how to take good phone messages. Because you have parents who are reporters, or then my mother working in the White House, my father was a reporter. We had multiple phone lines, and after she was in the White House, one that was directly to the White House. And so you had to really know how to answer the phone and take messages and get that person to spell their name and all these kinds of things. And then also learning how to be since they entertained as well in our home, learning how to, you had to go up, whoever was coming in the door, say hi, say your name, look them in the eye, take their coat, so life with Liz involved learning certain social skills, as well as other things. So that's, I don't know, that's a taste for what it was like.
Oh, I love it. Well, in a way, though, it seems like you weren't able to really. I mean, you were able to have a childhood, but at the same time, you had to be quite adept and quite mature at a young age to be able to balance all of these things.
Yeah, I think that's true. I don't, and because my mother was at home when I came home from school. It wasn't, I didn't have anyone driving me places or any of that. I had to have a certain amount of independence. So I think I did, in some ways at least, mature fairly quickly.
Well, I love that in a way, whether she meant to or not, consciously or unconsciously, she was helping to support your growth as an independent, autonomous woman with agency, which is great. Which makes me think, I mean, she clearly, as you've indicated, came from a line of strong, independent, literary and literate women. And as I'll want to get to in just a second, like she went on to inspire and help support other women who to become more independent and also to have a seat at the table, or literally, as be able to stand in the halls of power. But did she ever talk about that, about being influenced by strong women, wanting to be an influence as a strong woman?
Oh yes, she certainly talked about coming from strong women. She was very proud of her ancestry. And you see that if you saw the film, you saw a little bit of that. I mean, there was much more to it than we could cover in the film. But on both her maternal and paternal side, she descended from people who were some of the earliest Anglo settlers in Texas. And they were very much a part of the Texas Revolution, getting independence from Mexico. They were leaders, and the men, but the women were strong, and in a subsequent generation or two, also leaders. And you saw just a couple of them mentioned in the film, but they were suffragists, and they were very active. I mean, her great aunt Bertie was head of Women for Woodrow Wilson in the 1912 election, with an office on Fifth Avenue in New York, which was the headquarters for that campaign. And she was president of the Texas Federation of Women's Clubs, which women's clubs grew up in the latter part of the 19th century as women began to be able to focus on things beyond just their home. And so they became very important, and then they were part of the foundation for the suffrage movement, that women have been out, organizing and having all kinds of book clubs or other things where they're addressing social problems maybe in their community. Mary would know light years more about this than me, but anyway, these great aunts were very much involved in that kind of activity, political activity. In the state, and so my mother was raised on the stories of the men and the women, and she was very proud of it, and so that really gave her, I think, it's responsible for at least part of her confidence level. That she came from people, and her mother expected her to make something of herself, because she'd come from this lineage, so that definitely played a role, and she just was a generous spirit by nature. So when it came to helping other women, that wasn't like something she strategically planned. It just was natural to her. So when she became president of the Women's National Press Club, and when she was 34 years old, and the National Press Club it was men only. Women were not allowed. And not allowed to come to their newsmaker luncheons where they'd have, various heads of state and other important newsmakers come. So when my mother was president of the Women's National Press Club, she really worked on opening up more opportunities for women, other women journalists. And then, of course, she carries this promoting women through the Johnson administration, where Johnson was actually very high on the abilities of women. He had a very strong, well-educated mother, and he believed in the capabilities of women. He had a smart, politically savvy wife in the form of Lady Bird. And so he would do things like, he invited my mother to a cabinet meeting one time, and he said to all the cabinet members around the table, he said, I know you've got women in your departments that are very capable, and I know you probably have open positions and could appoint these women, promote these women. I want you to come back to the next cabinet meeting and tell me about all the women you've promoted. And so he had my mother in the meeting, and then she was in charge of being the liaison with these cabinet members who now had this assignment. Oh my God, we've got to actually promote women. So, and then of course it carries through to her activities in the women's movement, most importantly. But
yes. Which is a perfect segue, because I would love for you to share the really fantastic story of how your mother got involved in the women's movement.
Okay. Well, do you all know the name Betty Friedan? Most of you? I mean, raise your hand if you do, or if you don't. Okay, not everybody. Okay. Well, she was she's often called the godmother of the women's movement. She was a very smart woman who wrote a book that was a monumentally important book called the Feminine Mystique, and she had interviewed a lot of women, and her focus was really more on kind of middle class, white women. It wasn't like a diverse study of all women in America by any means, but she wrote about how a lot of women who were not just, as though it's not a good thing, but they were home raising children and cooking and doing what was considered the appropriate things for women. And she found that there was tremendous unhappiness, lots of depression among many women who really there was part of them that was like not being allowed to express itself through their confinement to the home. And so she wrote this book that was, I mean, do you want to add in on how important her book was?
They've all read it, surely.
Only a few of them raised their hand when I said, you know who Betty Friedan is?
Some snippets. Everybody in women's studies has at least read a paragraph or two.
Okay, anyway, all right, so Betty Friedan calls 1971, it's probably April or May. She gets a phone call from Betty Friedan, who she does not know. She knows who she is, of course, but she doesn't know her. And Betty says to her, Liz, the women's movement is in danger of hitting a wall. If we don't get political, if we don't start electing women to office and start getting laws enacted, in the local and state level as well as the federal level, then we're really just going to become, we're in danger of becoming an irrelevant movement because if we don't get political, we're not going to really make a mark on America. So she asked my mother to come to a meeting, and my mother said, may I bring my daughter? So I was college age, and I was able to go and sit on the floor in this very crowded hotel space with Bella Abz. I hope you know some of these names. Congresswoman Bella Abzug and Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm and Patsy Ming from Hawaii, and lots of women who were heads of organizations like League of Women Voters and Business and Professional Women and other such places. And then there were a smattering of younger people who were really active in the peace movement. And so anyway, there was this discussion about, okay, let's form a new organization to help get women elected to office. And so then a couple of months after that in Washington, the first meeting of the National Women's Political Caucus was held. And there were about 270 women, I think it was, from around the country who came, and they were a disparate lot, there was diversity of race and age and so forth, but also of opinion about what are the issues that we should be most concerned about. So it was a boisterous meeting with women debating things in the corridors and in the bathrooms at the hotel and in the aisles and so forth. And so my mother, in describing it to me and talking about it being this, like heated, and there were all these strong women debating and so forth, she said, but then And she said, there was a lot of arguing. She said, but then, I've never been to a revolution before. So she just thought it was, she said, called it the most thrilling meeting she ever attended. So it was like catnip for her. And so she was hooked, and her involvement went from there. But that was the start.
Which is so great. I love that she's sort of thriving on this free exchange of ideas, even if it might appear to be, you know, in conflict. It actually is about working out, like just how do we create something out of, in essence, nothing.
Yes.
And then how do we stand by it and behind it. Now, we unfortunately know that the ERA, Equal Rights Amendment, did not pass. How did she take that?
Well, okay, well, we'll talk about while she's alive. If you want to talk about now, then I can argue that it has. But in any event, okay, in any event.
First that, then
No, let's go back. Okay, so the Equal Rights Amendment, which had languished in Congress for many decades, 1923, Alice Paul, one of the great figures of the suffrage movement, wrote it. And it was introduced in Congress, I believe every Congress it was introduced, up until 1972, when finally the women's movement's gotten underway. And the caucus and lots of other organizations, the National Organization of Women and others, have been up on the Hill lobbying, and you have at least a handful of more women members of Congress. And so it passes by huge bipartisan majorities. I mean, it wasn't even close. I mean, if you can imagine, Republicans and Democrats together supporting the passage of this amendment. And it quickly sailed through 20 states. And then it began to slow down a bit if there were more states added, because it had, for the ratification. And it needed to reach the threshold of 38 states to become part of the Constitution. Unfortunately, Congress had put in the preamble of the amendment a time limit. Now, it was not part of the text of the amendment that was being ratified around the states, but it was in the preamble. And so in '77, they went back, and my mother testified before Congress, among other people, to extend the deadline for several more years, because they were getting quite close. But by that time, the opposition had gotten really organized, led by a woman named Phyllis Schlafly. And so they would bake cupcakes and take them into state houses and talk about how terrible a thing it would be if the Equal Rights Amendment came into being, because then their husbands wouldn't, they would say, I'm not saying this was true, this is what they said. Your husbands would no longer have an obligation to support you. And there would be co-ed bathrooms, and there would be, abortion on demand paid by the government. I mean, this is not part of the Equal Rights Amendment. So anyway, so a lot of opposition, and it was just enough in the last 3 states to didn't quite squeak through by that deadline. And it was like hugely disappointing to my mother and other women that had worked so hard to get it there and almost make it. But she wrote not long thereafter. She said, "I'm sure it will come to pass. I have no doubt about it. I think we'll look back on it like we now look back on when African Americans had to sit in the back of the bus. We'll look back on it someday, and how could that possibly have been?" So she had faith, and I won't get into the now, but because it's complicated, but I'll explain it unless you want me to. Otherwise, we can go ahead with other questions.
Well, I mean,
Okay.
now I'm
Mary's
kind of
going
intrigued.
to go for it. Oh, go for it? Okay.
Where are we now? And is there any
Well,
opportunity?
since that time, and actually in the last decade, so 35 states ratified it. In the last decade, 3 more have. North Carolina, Illinois, and Colorado, I believe, are the ones. And so it reached the threshold. But and that happened, Trump was in his first term. And so the thing that happens is, when an amendment goes through ratification, is that the Archivist of the United States publishes it. It's a purely ministerial act. In other words, it's not discretion. Does it become part or not? But anyway, Trump made sure that the Justice Department give instructions to the archivist not to publish the amendment. Biden, before he left office, just ignored the archivist and basically just said, and you correct me factually if I say anything that you don't think's right, but basically he made an announcement and said, it is now the law of the land. 38 states have ratified it. Because there have been various court cases over history where there was a time limit, and it's always been held to be invalid. That a time limit is not part of the process of getting constitutional amendments. So why it should apply to this and not to anything else before, so there's been litigation, and there will be much more litigation over this, no doubt. But that's, that's where it sits. And there's a great organization in Washington called ERA Coalition, made up of organizations, it and other organizations that are supporting the ratification. And if you want to find out more about it, you can always go into ER Coalition's website, and they've got a lot of good information there.
I have a question.
Yes.
So, in terms of everyday democracies and the small acts of civic agency that each person can do, how can our students weigh in on this at this point in time?
Well, basically, you are represented by members of Congress. Did Tennessee ratify?
Oh, yeah, early on.
Yeah, early on. Actually, Texas was one of the first states, you can imagine.
Tennessee wanted to rescind it, but they...
Yeah.
One day it wanted to
There have been a few states that have rescinded, but also on other amendments and various court cases, the precedents are that you can't rescind.
Mm-hmm.
Once you've ratified, that's it. So the law is very much, and the American Bar Association is totally on board with this. Is, it has met all the requirements for being part of our Constitution. So, if you come from a state that hasn't ratified it, that would be one way to lobby your representatives, your state legislature on it. Federally, it's really, you could make your voice heard and ask Congress, because Congress can. The House passed a resolution withdrawing that thing in the preamble, the time limit. But of course, the House was dominated by the other party, by the Republicans, and they, that was never even brought to a floor vote, I don't think. So, so you could also make your views known to your members from the House of Representatives who represent you. But, there are other ways to, organize and educate, fellow people, your peers about where it stands and why it's important. I mean, that would be another step that you could take. I don't know, Barry, you're the head of the Democracy Project, so you probably have a boatload of ideas.
Well, I've got a whole bunch of questions.
Oh, okay, all right, please.
Oh, okay, so our students often feel, and this generation has come to feel or think, much to my surprise, that baby boomers have no voice or appropriate perspective, that we are something out of yesteryear, we're dinosaurs, and that feminism is not something they wish to embrace. Would you like to correct that idea?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I know, I mean, look, we're not dinosaurs.
Is feminism relevant to young people in their teens and 20s today?
I mean, just know for starters that all of you stand on the shoulders of both men and women, especially women, but men who have fought for equal rights for women as well. You stand on the shoulders of those that have been fighting these battles for well over 175 years at least, since Seneca Falls in 1848. It took 3 generations of women to get the battling to get the 19th Amendment adopted. All the deciders for the 19th Amendment were men. There were no women making the decisions in terms of the state legislatures or the Congress, because it was all men making the decisions. Then 100 years have passed and we've made tremendous progress, in large part because of baby boomers and the generation before us who participated in the women's movement and made sure changes were made. And a lot of women who have run for office, gotten elected, and exercised tremendous power. You can look at Nancy Pelosi and many others who've had a huge influence on our country. And so, yes, it's still relevant. You have opportunities that we didn't have when we were first getting out of college, and God knows your grandparents or great-grandparents never had, and you've benefited from all these things, and there's more to do, there's more work to do, but you have a I would argue you have a responsibility as a citizen in this world to make sure you carry the torch forward for what will be the next generation. So everybody's got a responsibility to in this democracy of ours, to make sure that we make progress, continue to make progress on this front and on many others. But yes, women's rights are absolutely still important. There is still discrimination on the job front and in many other ways. And so it is. Be proud. If you are willing to call yourself a feminist, be proud and do it.
And vigilant. Please continue.
Well, all right, so in terms of just details of narrative and story, when you would go with your parents to these big events, you said both in the summer of 1960, you were both at the Democratic Convention in Los Angeles and you were at the Republican Convention in Chicago. Your parents were both working the floor down in the pit.
Yep.
What were you and your brother doing that whole time?
Getting into mischief. Yeah, I mean, actually, that convention, I was just 10. So I was not in the convention hall. I was everywhere. We were staying in a hotel room, delegates and everybody was staying. I'm running around, looking, observing and doing these kinds of things, and so was my brother. But I was not in the convention hall. When it got to be the next convention, 1964, from that point on, I was at every Democratic convention until, I'd have to think, 84, I think was the first Democratic convention I was not at. And I was at a couple of Republican conventions because my father was a journalist and continuing to cover them, and so I did go to a couple of Republican conventions as well.
Were you given a press pass?
Yes, he got me, passed so I could run around and
Child privilege.
observe. And at the 68 Democratic Convention, I was a page on the floor for the Connecticut delegation. I picked that delegation because Paul Newman was a delegate. So that was a very talking about a boisterous convention. I mean, that's the one where there were, Mayor Daley had the police out physically attacking the Vietnam War protesters.
In Chicago. You were
in
there.
Chicago. I was there.
Wow.
It was wild. That was the most intense convention I ever went to. But
I'm wondering if you're...
oh, and I later served as a delegate. I mean, I was a delegate in 92, in 96, and in 2000, I was elected a delegate from California to the Democratic conventions.
Cool.
So, anyway, sorry.
Your mother, and we all saw this in the film, and I remember her, I knew her when I was a little girl. She had a rather ribald sense of humor. And she got away with it. Her humor allowed her to communicate broadly. Was she just a funny person?
She was just a funny person. I mean, being raised in a big family and during the Depression, and having lots of, they moved to Austin grew up in this little town of Salado, but at age 7 she goes to Austin. The whole family moves so that the eldest boy can go to the University of Texas, and then each of the succeeding children can go to the University of Texas, which you could do in those days for $12.50 a semester. So even in the Depression, it wasn't prohibitive to do that. But so it was a lively household. Other cousins would come and live in the house also, so they could go to the university. So there were always lots of people, and so laughter was important, and so she had license to be funny, and I'm sure others were funny as well at times. But she definitely got away with so much more throughout her life than she could have otherwise, were she not funny. Because she was kind of earth mothery and sort of lovable, and the humor allowed her to, it disarmed people who might otherwise be opposing something she was advocating for or doing. So it was a great tool in her hands.
Well, it was often tinged in a little racy, I would say a little sexual innuendo.
Yeah, from time to time. I mean, she didn't tell dirty jokes, but some of her flip answers, spontaneous answers, could have a double edge.
A double edge, yeah.
Well, and I do wonder if that, because there's sort of the role of laughter and humor as a way to disarm people, but I wonder too if that was a way to be one of the boys in a way, because that particular kind of humor seems like, wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
Well, yeah, I mean,
I can hang with y'all.
Mary may be overplaying her. I mean, because she didn't run around using curse words and stuff. She was a little more proper than that, bold and brassy, but proper at the same time. But yeah, I think that she was more accepted with men, maybe because she was funny. I mean, people wanted to be around her, because she was entertaining. So it helped in all kinds of ways, and she would use it to sometimes ridicule the opposition. So she had a whole lineup of, and I can't cite it to you, but from memory, but here are the 5 types of men in state legislatures who oppose the ERA, and she would have senator apron strings and blah blah blah. But she'd go through a description of each type of man in the opposition that she would come across, and so she would use it in that sort of way too.
What do you think your mother would say to our students here in 2025 today about the times where we are? There's certain topics we can't discuss. I mean, we fall firmly as women into both diversity and equity and inclusion issues that's ongoing, and yet we're not allowed to speak about those. Famous women's names are being taken off the wall, their portraits are being taken down. What might she say about all that?
She'd be appalled. I mean, she'd be completely appalled at banning books and, from libraries and all these efforts to prohibit people from being exposed to ideas that a certain contingent of people don't like. I mean, what gives them the right? This is a free country. We're supposed to be a marketplace of ideas, as John Stuart Mill said, so eloquently taught us long before any of us were around. I mean, historically taught us. So she'd be very appalled at that. She'd be very appalled at the level of partisanship and at the level of hate, and at the sort of we've accomplished so much in terms of race relations in this country. We're not where we need to be, of course, but we have accomplished in the last 50, 75 years a great deal. And to see people try to push that backwards or slow it down would just be abhorrent to her. So she wouldn't like it at all, and she'd be fighting against it.
it's time for us to ask our students, who, especially those of you who've been in the Women's and Gender Studies program, we have at least 3 classes here, if not more. What questions do you have for Ms. Carpenter?
My question was just, how did it feel, like, when was the time when you actually realized, holy crap, my mother is like this unstoppable force? Like, when did you really understand what she was doing?
Good question.
Oh gosh, well, I think probably pretty young, because first of all, she was who she was. So when she was at home, she was kind of the same out there, high energy personality. So I think that, and then it was just, because I would be taken to things as a young kid. I mean, for those of you who saw the film, when she's president of the Women's National Press Club, they have the annual dinner. Every press organization in Washington always has their annual dinner. And you see depicted there her with President Eisenhower and the Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn, and the Majority Leader of the Senate, Lyndon Johnson. So there she is with the 3 most powerful men in Washington. So I'm like, 5 years old, and I'm taken to that dinner, and I have, lots of pictures of me shaking hands with Eisenhower and Mamie, and that's his wife, and that kind of thing. So I sort of, began to know, oh, people are paying attention to her. She's somebody. So early on, I'd say.
Who else has got a great question? Absolutely, yes.
I have a question more on what it was like having such a strong feminist mother. Do you believe that there were any lessons, specifically with being a woman, that you were taught that you believe that not most people who are raised in more, I guess, traditional households are raised being taught?
So what about?
She said,
Yeah, I've always raised, but in the household I was raised in. But what about how?
in terms of traditional household,
What was my experience with? Because so many, many of my friends had mothers that were stay-at-home, more traditional mothers, and I was actually grateful for many of these women because, on our street there were 2 women in particular who, I could count on if I really needed help with something.
were you a latchkey kid before that term came?
Well, we had a housekeeper that was there during the day, so we weren't abandoned, and we were fed dinner, and so we were taken care of in that sense. But it wasn't like having a nanny or something. This was a housekeeper who had other things to do too. But 2 wonderful, one and then later another, but both wonderful women that I was extremely close to. So I had, so I had my surrogate, a number of surrogate moms, as well as my own, I guess you'd say.
Other questions? Oh, come now. Things that you have been studying in
We
your
said one
class.
over there too.
Oh.
Yeah.
There was a question back there. Let's take that one.
Did your mom work with the Kennedy women at all? Because I know that, she worked under Lyndon B. Johnson.
Yeah. Well, that's a good question, and actually, yes, and the time when that was, she knew them all, of course, but the time when that happened to the greatest extent was the '60 campaign. And Kennedy's been nominated. He's the first Catholic that's ever been nominated for president, and that's kind of a big deal. Many people were, disturbed about the fact that it was a Catholic, and so my mother took several of Jack Kennedy's sisters, along with Lady Bird, and I think on at least one occasion, Rose Kennedy, who was Jack Kennedy's mother, on these what they call flying tea parties. They would fly to places mostly in the South, and there would be public events where women could come and hear from these Kennedy sisters. And so as my mother put it, they wanted to show off that these Kennedy women didn't have horns, as Catholics. And they all sounded like, they all had the Boston accent, and they sounded like their brother. So people were fascinated with that. And thousands of people would show up for these flying tea parties. I went to one of them. I mean, it was a local one in Virginia, Northern Virginia, somewhere just outside of Washington. But that was the time when she did the most, with Ethel Kennedy and Eunice Kennedy Shriver and Jean Kennedy Smith, and I guess I said occasionally Rose. Because Jackie in '60 was pregnant with John Kennedy Jr., and she really wasn't a particularly political animal. And so she asked, and Lady Bird really volunteered also, for her to take over a lot of the campaigning, because she didn't want to lose the baby. I think she'd had a miscarriage or two before that. So Lady Bird was a very active campaigner during that election year, as well as in '64.
So your mother and Mrs. Johnson were the Southern cultural interpreters for this New England cohort.
Exactly, for this New England family, and introducing them to women in the South.
There was a question over here. Yes.
And I'm glad that I had an extra moment to get it. First, I want to congratulate you on your film. I haven't seen it yet.
Oh.
But I feel like I have met your mother, at least physically now. And I know I was affected and exposed to her throughout my life. I wasn't where you were, but I was live on the other end of the tube in some cases. But I think I got a message from my mother, and this is going to ring a bell. Virginia Kennedy, another clan, by the way, not the Irish, were the ones that took the top part of the island. Anyway, she would ask you, have you considered making another film? That's a possible solution to addressing what's going on now, and I would love to volunteer as a film producer and writer myself. And a mama's boy, apron strings, I'm amazing.
It sounds like you should make the film.
Well, whoever is,
Well,
I'm supposed to be humble. My significant other, Mrs. Galloway, Mrs. Duck, would say, don't tell them too much. Listen,
Yeah.
what I heard today, and I walked over, I'm a neighbor to the school. It's been a while since I've been here. I brought a son here about 10 years ago. He's about to graduate. Anybody in here that it's taken more than 9 years, don't feel bad. In this case, it was a good story. He got hired up as a sophomore at a high-tech, so it's cool. Anyway, I do.
Well, so may I interpret that and say he's asking, might there be yet another film about your mother?
Yeah, I don't think
did
so.
I lived in Upper Marlboro, Maryland. Both of you you grew up together, am I understanding this
Yes.
correctly?
We knew each other as children, yes.
Somewhere around, my dad was in the Beltway, but go ahead.
Okay,
You seem
yeah,
familiar.
no, I mean, my fellow filmmaker, Abby Ginsburg, who I mentioned, she's the accomplished filmmaker, and she is continuing to make films all the time.
She's iconic.
So, this took 3 years of my life. It was great. I'm so glad it turned out well. I'm glad lots of people are seeing it and really responding, responding well to it. Not just liking it, that's great, but they're feeling inspired by it, and that's the important thing. And learning something about the times in which my mother operated, because we really wanted people to get that historical context at the same time. But I think this is it in terms of filmmaking for me. But I do plan to still write a book, so that's how I'm going to, because I've got a lot of great material that couldn't possibly go into the film. So I think that's going to be my next project.
Well, if I endeavor to do it, to take it, or at least to get it going, would you consult?
Potentially.
And next question over there.
And I should have given it to you too. It's about the movement, not so much the film.
I don't have a question, but I wanted to say that the documentary blew me away, and it was very shocking to me that I had never heard of her or any of her work or anything surrounding her really. Oops. So that like was just insane to me, and it was very like emotional, you know, and very inspiring. So thank you.
Wow, thank you for your comment, really appreciate that.
Here's another question, a couple more, right there.
It's also more of a comment, but I think this documentary made me in a lot of ways realize, like, if you look at press secretaries, no matter like who the president is right now, it's like a lot of the time it is a woman, and she is answering like really hard questions. Watching this made me realize, you know, like she almost just trailblazed for like so many women in the future to be able to hold those types of jobs, especially
Yes.
in office, and especially what like women in the past have done there. Which I guess it's cool, like, I'm younger, so I see it today, and I'm like, oh, okay, that's just a thing, like, that's just who runs that role. But then, like, I get to see a person who is, like, on the forefront of that and be, like, a powerful female figure is, like, it's very good for somebody like me to see that, so.
Wonderful, thank you so much.
You had a question.
Hi, my name is Ava. I just should probably introduce myself because, I don't know, anyway, sorry, I'm nervous. I'm in Dr. Chabret's class. It's Women in Media, and in your opinion, what would you say is the most important message from your mother that we should carry when telling other people about her and the feminist movement today?
Yeah, I'd say, well, you can see here something she wrote on this sign, which says, "The fight goes on and we go on with the fight." So I think she would want to say, don't, because we live in difficult times, let's all be honest, you know, this is and a lot of people are feeling despair and discouraged, but she would say, this is not the time to tune out, it's not the time to feel paralyzed, it's time to get going. And so I think that would be her message.
Thank you.
There's one more question, and we'll let that be it.
I know your mom had a lot of achievements in her career, but I was wondering, what do you think her biggest achievement was that she was the most proudest of?
Great question.
Well, the White House years were the most exciting for her, and also I think she felt like she was doing important work in terms of promoting the environmental programs and all of the Great Society, the poverty programs and the civil rights and so forth. So she would be, she would have considered that maybe the highlight, I guess, I would say. But she loved her involvement in the women's movement. I mean, she loved being a reporter too, so I mean really. So I think the accomplishments in the White House, and just in terms of accomplishments, I mean, if the ERA had passed during her time, I think she would have pointed to that. But she, you know, made a lot of headway with it, with many other women involved. But it didn't reach full satisfaction, shall we say? But getting more women elected to office, and she played a role in campaigning for so many, and campaigning for men too. I mean, it's not just women. But she was always very proud when somebody she worked for got elected. So I don't know, those are the main things that come to mind.
Those of us who study and write about women's history know that so much of women's history is about people we just have never heard of before. And yet when we do hear of them and we find out what they did, we're blown away. And just as you all were commenting, what have we not known about this person? So I'm thrilled that MTSU has given us the opportunity to introduce to you all Mrs. Liz Carpenter, and through her daughter, Miss Christy Carpenter. And I'm going to say that her life is a model for us, and we don't give up, we keep pushing forward. And let's dismiss and come meet Christy, and we'll have a reception in the lobby of the Honors Building.